This Scale Model Basics sponsored by Hobby Zone USA, your source for hobby storage solutions, hard to find modeling tools, and aftermarket modeling needs. Welcome to Scale Model Basics. I'm Tim Kidwell. Let's talk about gradients and how we use them on our models. Now, those of us who have had a computer, we've probably messed with gradients in, say, Photoshop. And what it is at the basic level is going from one color to another in a smooth transition. Or another way to look at it, and what we would do mostly on our models, is taking a base color and going from a dark version of it to a light version of it in a smooth transition. When we talk about post shading, when we talk about color modulation, what we're essentially doing is making gradients. So what I want to do is show you how to paint a gradient, and let's use blue as an example, and let's head to the workshop. The first step for painting a gradient is to paint your base color. In this case, I'm using Tamiya Flat Blue, and go ahead and apply it in thin coats and build up your color evenly over your model. All right. Take your base color, then darken it with a couple of drops of black. Now I have used a little bit extra because I want to make sure that it shows up on camera. But how much shading you're going to do for your base color is going to be dependent on your own tastes and the kind of model that you're painting. So painting from one end here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my thumb as a reference point, and that's where the base color is. And then I'm going to paint basically from the center this way. I'm going to paint this new shade, okay, and aiming at an angle. Now you can see that difference there, and what I want is to build it up toward the one end where the shade is going to be, but not super heavy where it transitions into the blue. I want to keep that transparent. For the final shade, add extra black to the shade that you have already made, and then pick a space, a spot about halfway down that you're not going to go past except for just a little bit of overspray. And then we can do this grade down here. So we're moving from the darkest to a lighter shade to the blue. Now we basically do the same thing, but we do it with white. And then the final one, just here from basically halfway down this last highlight. So you can see going from blue up to the lightest blue, and then from blue down to the darkest blue. We can now take what we know about gradients and we can apply them to our model. Gradients really came from figure modeling, figure painting, and they were appropriated. The idea was appropriated over to armor modeling. And what it allows you to do under the term color modulation is paint light. Paint how light affects your model. Now, what I've done here is I have primed this so that it's easier to show you how light would affect this particular model. So obviously up here where it's really bright white, this is where the most light's going to hit, down through your transition zones, and then to the colors where they're going to be darkest. Very much like what we see here. One bit of advice, if you use a guide like this where you have primed your model so that you've got the light areas up top and the dark areas underneath, what you may want to do is take your phone and snap photos of the model from all sorts of angles, because as you start putting paint down, you're going to obscure some of this. And if you need that guide still, those photos are going to be really helpful for you. So, you know, front, back, top, both sides, bottom, you're probably pretty much going to know. But that will help you then remember where those transitions are. So let's apply what we know in the spray booth. For me, I am going to base coat most of this. The base color is now down. How dark you make your shadows is one of personal preference and taste. The darker you make your shadow, obviously the more stark the difference is going to be from the base color. Now for me, I know that I'm going to come in and do a second darker color in here. So what I'm doing is, like we did before on that paint chip, I'm doing the first not super dark shadow. So you can see, even now, the modulation is starting to take effect from down here where I've been concentrating on shadows, and then making sure to come in and hit where those shadows would be underneath those angled missile pods in here along the back, just to give some hint that there's supposed to be shadow down in there. Now I'm going to come back in here and I'm just going to hit these really deep recesses with a darker blue, and then we'll start on the highlights.
Okay.
Now you can start with the first highlight. Here's the key. You are not trying to obliterate your base coat. What you're trying to do is apply the highlight so that the base coat shows through, and you're concentrating more on the centers of these panels and where the light is going to play off of them. So your final highlight, what you're going to do is even a smaller, tighter area, focusing more on your corners and edges and those sorts of places, just to start picking up the visual interest. What a difference, right? You can see the gradient that we put over here onto the paint chip. You can see how the model actually mimics that gradient. Darker down here, lighter at the top, and then obviously lighter around the edges, really where light will play. And you can see that it's doing a pretty good job of, making it visually interesting. Now, for the deepest, darkest shadows and for your brightest highlights, you're probably going to want to come in and use a brush for those. Black way down in here in these recessed areas that are just not going to have any light at all. Way deep back in under here. And then up top, for those most salient points where you think that highlights should be, you're going to use white or a very, very lightened version of your base color. Color modulation isn't for everyone, but it is a neat way to add visual interest to your model. Now, the critique would be that if overdone, color modulation can end up making your model look cartoonish. Okay, and that's possible, but the thing to remember is this, that this is just one step. You're still going to add washes. You're still going to come in and maybe do filters, or you're going to put any number of other weathering effects onto your model, and that's going to tone back what you've done with the color modulation. And in some cases, you may be looking for that pushed, right? That really artistic sort of finish, and color modulation will help you do that. What you need to remember is that this is an artistic expression, so don't beat yourself up too bad if somebody comes in and says, oh, well, that looks cartoony, because if it looks good to you, that's what really matters. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.